Well, if my last two videos aren't anything to expect for this one, it's definitely getting the yellow symbol and probably just resulting in the whole channel getting shut down. Mainly because of what I have to say, and if me posting, again, anything lately, it's just, I'm getting decimated by the age suspension thing. You know what it is. It doesn't bode well. But screw it, we ball. In the events of Killing Floor 1 and Killing Floor 2, they're fairly interesting for several reasons. While you may be inclined to believe it's simply a zombie game where you just try to survive wave after wave of mutated zombies, you'd actually be wrong in believing that. Way to go, nerd. No, actually, depending on what you believe to be canon or not, the lore runs relatively deep. But more importantly, this video is necessary to set up the framework for the biological breakdowns of these creatures in the future, which is why you find yourself here now. Because to understand the later mutations that Homo sapiens in general would have issues contending with, we must first understand how it all began and what was the most basic form that kickstarted a program which led to the destruction of billions of lives. But first, this episode is sponsored by Manscaped. Let me ask you an important question. Are you ready to shave off all your hair, eyebrows included, without the threat of nicking yourself? If you answered yes, then boy do I have a deal for you. Head a link in the description or going to manscaped.com and using code Roanoke, you can get 20% off your order plus free international shipping and 2 free gifts. As humans, we have a lot of hair. Actually, we have as much hair as a chimp, it's just finer. And it doesn't matter if you're male or female, we are all equally hairy. I personally have thicker hair, which is apropos because with Christmas on the horizon, Manscaped has come out with their new performance package. These are specifically made for men in mind, with the best-selling Lawnmower 4.0 that is waterproof, cordless, and has advanced safe skin technology to reduce nicks and cuts on sensitive areas. You will also get the Crop Preserver, which is below the waist deodorant, as well as the Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer, so your mustache doesn't just grow into your nose hair. All of this accompanied with the refined cologne, which can be contained within the Shed travel bag while you wear your anti-chafing boxer briefs. So don't wait, go to manscaped.com and use promo code Roanoke to get 20% off plus free international shipping, and with it, 2 free gifts. So I think we should break this thing down into 2 parts, not 2 videos, but 2 parts in the video itself, so it makes the most amount of sense and we can see the consequences of creating human meat paste. The first part will be discussing the actual lore of KF1 and KF2, which will set the stage for understanding what actually happened in the first place, as there actually does seem to be a lot of misunderstandings about the outbreak itself. The second part will be discussing the creation and physiology of this creature known as the Clot, and will serve as the basis for the entire project, her mutations arising from this specific creature. Not going to be a terribly long one today with the hour-long video I just released that got, God bless it got age restricted. Good lord! Anyways, your boy is still tired from that one. So let's get into some good old-fashioned video game lore. Been a hot minute. As always, it starts with a company that produces force multipliers and for some reason has its fingers in the genetics game as well. Whenever you come across those two things like together, it's probably not going to turn out well, at least for the average person out there. The specific company known as Horzine would be tasked by the British government with tipping the scales well past who's got the best tech out there. No, they would be entrusted with creating a super soldier program that by and large was actually successful, just in the wrong direction. Upon receiving this contract, Kevin Clemelli, which I'm pretty sure is Clemelli, would immediately have his team as well as himself dive into the genetics of a person in an attempt to create these soldiers that they were tasked with building. But Kevin himself had his own ulterior motives that would spell destruction for humanity, at least in Europe, as he and his team treaded down some pretty dark paths to achieve what they set out to do. And disclaimer, I did say billions of lives. Likely there's going to be a Killing Floor 3, and it is going to get past Europe. Just throwing that out there. As the project continued and the human genome was mapped out and clones were created in order to make these soldiers, Kevin began to think to himself, you know, I have a son who's expired. Why don't I try to bring back my boy instead of just trying to create soldiers? I have the funding, who's gonna know? So he set out with a side project that would be the first deviation that would prove to be a massive issue. As Kevin began work, he mixed in the DNA of his son into the clones that they were creating, but it became apparent that despite his best efforts, there was in fact no way to bring back his actual son. But in mixing in the DNA of his deceased son, what he did create was a creature known as the Clot, which we will be covering momentarily. Clot, as mentioned previously, would become the basis for all different variants of Zeds that we see throughout the different locations that humanity is attempting to overcome, apart from the female versions, which would require a different set of DNA, which will be in a video in the future. Over time, the success of building these Clots would start to mess with Kevin's head as he continued to drift away from the parameters requested by the British government and more towards his own vision of the future and what the Zeds represented. Deep in the underground facility in London, he continued to build and create different, more powerful Zeds, and over time, outposts would be established all across the continent, and this is why Europe gets screwed to the wall during these events. Another notable facility during these these events was the wire forest located near Wales. And hopefully I pronounced that correctly. The females, as mentioned previously, would be housed in this facility, and their original creation was due to the request of active camouflage development for soldiers in the future. But as the testing continued on them, this facility would go rogue under the direction of Kevin as they continued to develop this technology. Ultimately, they would succeed in this endeavor and created a variant that was capable of hiding in plain sight and served as a real threat against regular soldiers and civilians. Eventually, all the creations would be noticed as there were various escapes which required the creations to be actually contained. Of course, these were regarded as like wives' tales or just ramblings of people, nothing more, but it hinted at a larger threat coming down the pipeline later on. As the project continued to grow, things continued to grow out of control. They call them volunteers, but in reality they were probably voluntold. Most of the humans that became involved in this project were just straight up kidnapped and experimented on. This would happen as one scientist in particular got involved, known as Hans Volter. Old Papa Hans over here was a leftover relic from World War II on the wrong side of things. Becoming a mad scientist way back in the day, he would perform these experiments on himself, which led to a ridiculously long lifespan, but necessitated the use of an exoskeleton to support himself. Coming into contact with Kevin, and he actually seeing this man is still alive, that pretty much just makes his work speak for himself. He would then supply Hans with everything he needed to start his experiments. As time passed, Hans would be sent more and more clots. Instead of training these clots and altering their physical form, he would instead skin them and use the muscle and bone to create larger variants, which would go on to become the flesh pounds. One of these creatures is canonically identified, if that's what you want to believe, to have started the outbreak to begin with, as they were injected with a cocktail of adrenaline and other chemicals, which made it berserk and then break out of the compound. Although it is unknown if it brought others with it, because these things aren't really that altruistic, what is known is it's able to find a Halloween party at an old castle and decimate every person there, leaving only one DJ alive, known as DJ Scully. Because of these micro outbreaks and reports of monsters showing up in Europe, this leaked information began to raise concerns of local governments until finally reporters would catch wind of something nefarious going on. Like, remember when they actually did their job? But no, crazy to think that there are certain events going on in the world right now that groups literally have their names of the people involved with an island, and yet nobody has heard anything. Crazy. Anyhow, the horrible world we live in aside, let's go back to the fictional one. It's more fun over there. Eventually, disguised reporters would move into one of the Horzine facilities and be appalled at what they found. As they continued moving through, they would go on to release one of the specimens, which in turn may have also started the outbreak. Again, it's not 100% confirmed what actually started it, because for all we know, it could have been Kevin himself. This is because as the project continued on, Kevin would go on to completely abandon it and its original goal. Because all of the clots made after had his son's DNA added into the mix, this meant that every variation he created with the clots, or even the clots themselves, were essentially genetically related to him. Even the female variants in the wire forest were said to be his daughter Rachel's DNA, meaning those two were his children. Because they were his children, and he viewed them as such, the project was abandoned, and in his mind, it began shifting over to replacing humanity with what he assumed to be a superior version, the Zeds that he actually created. Never mind the fact that intellectually, if you weren't all that bright, and if you just annihilated every human in the process, then, you yourself expire, you basically left the planet to a bunch of listless Zed creations. Whether it was the journalist, the flesh pound, or Kevin himself, it does not matter, because the result was the same. The outbreak had begun, and despite humanity's best effort, it began to look pretty bleak for our species. It is known that first and foremost, it began in London and spread out from there. As civilians fell in the thousands to these creatures, some would continue to fight, but given Europe's anti-force multiplier mentality, this meant a lot of civilians with really no training had to go hand to hand with these things, which left a lot of meat on the ground. Militaries would fare better given their ability to actually fight back, but just barely so. It became apparent to the British government around this time that these things may be a result of the contract that they gave to Horzine, which alarmed them somewhat, because at the end of this, if humanity survived, someone was going to have to answer for it. Just like humans, we got to find somebody to blame. Although it really was their fault, technically. Well, connected fault. But because of this, many teams would be sent to the outbreak site and then have to fight their way in to cover up the connections to the government. This would prove to be a high price paid, as many of the teams were torn apart the closer they got. A man named Private Schneider would be the only surviving member of his team, as he attempted to survive in London alone, fighting every step of the way. While he was fighting for survival out there, another team would apparently be more successful in their endeavors. They began to close in on Kevin himself to put an end to the creator of the Zeds tying up that loose end. This would not end up being the case, however. As the team moved in to neutralize him, they would fail to reach him in time, as he locked himself away in a top secret laboratory with his most indoctrinated employees. Utilizing all the research that Horzine Company had come to learn with their experimentations, they were able to turn him into the ultimate counter to anything the government could throw at him. Robotics, mutations, cloaking, everything that had been seen in the Zeds was mixed into him to form the Patriarch. Shortly after completion, he confronted the team that had made it into the lab areas as he tore them apart and made his his escape. With the knowledge that Kevin had, or the Patriarch at this point, because Kevin just sounds hilarious, he would then leave London in shambles as the government continued to think this was a one-front war, and only London was the target. He would leave London and then head to his other facilities all over England and release the specimens there as they began to flood out all over the country, ending even more in the process, so F's in the chat for Hidden Xperia and Wisefish. Take what I said about the people in London and extrapolate it out over the entire country. Very few people had the ability to actually fight back against these things, but with that said, some did, and lead was very effective at putting these creatures down permanently. Those that would go on to survive likely did so because they had some countermeasure to protect themselves or were just plain lucky. It did not take long before the military itself was overwhelmed, which left everyone on their own with little promise of support. However, there's one thing more powerful in the eyes of humans than a monster coming to tear your body in half, and that is the promise of money. Interestingly, a new business venture would sprout up as a result of these rampaging monsters. The concept of, well, if you're going to be fighting these things for survival anyways, you may as well get paid to do so, was kind of adopted, and mercenaries became the name of the game.
Who touched my gun?
These mercenary groups were composed of those who have shown that they could survive the onslaught or were just incredibly lucky to have made it this far. They were tasked with going into specific areas and conducting raids on the Zeds and in general, just taking them out to the best of their ability. This did not always prove successful, as you might imagine, but they would basically do anything for money. Eventually, mercenaries, through their war of attrition, would open up areas previously inundated with Zeds by chipping away at the numbers and putting pressure on the Patriarch. Through weeks of fighting, they became better organized, linked up with other mercenary groups, and rescued other survivors who were still fighting or just rampaging themselves. As Team Homo sapiens numbers dwindled in the pacifist department, it would swell in Team Ramrod area. More and more teams would go and fight, which ultimately led to a confrontation with the Patriarch himself. The issue was, however, despite putting him down, reports would begin coming in of him being spotted and fought by other groups, which led to the speculation that he may have actually cloned himself several times, which that's really not that far-fetched given what Kevin was already accomplishing. After months of fighting to find the Patriarch and millions of Zeds put down, the mercenaries would close in on the last remaining stronghold of the Patriarch. This particular stronghold was located under a subway system. Being guided by the daughter of Kevin, Rachel, whose genetics were the basis for the female Zeds, they attempted to corner the Patriarch and detonate the reactors, ending the threat once and for all. However, upon arriving, they learned that the Patriarch had already escaped to France by train. They still resolved to blow the reactors, destroying the facility and chasing down the Patriarch later. As they go to accomplish this, they were besieged by two Patriarchs, and they were able to destroy them and then blow the facility, which then resulted in them chasing the original Kevin into France. Now, canonically, this is where it ends, but there is one interesting thing to note. It's clear the world governments at this time were well aware of the Zed threat. Despite France's objection, there is an event that takes place that could show the scale of what's happening. Upon getting to France, you find the area is in shambles with Zeds everywhere. The area looks completely war-torn. In fact, the Eiffel Tower is burning down even though it's made of metal. And here's where France's objections come into place. Nukes are being deployed all around Paris in order to limit the Zeds' ability to spread. How do you know it's Paris? Well, besides the Eiffel Tower over there, but if you look up on the plaque on the wall, the nation of Texas can be seen, which was officially accepted as an independent nation in 1839 by France, hence the embassy in Paris. This fate of Paris isn't too outside the realm of possibilities because remember, Hans is also still floating around out there, and they mentioned that there are facilities all over Europe, and not to mention the Patriarch did escape France. So with him on the mainland having access to those facilities, it's clear this sets the stage for Killing Floor 3 and a much larger conflict across the continent itself. So to understand how these Zeds were even created, we must first understand where these things came from and how they arise to what they are. Now, I bet you think I'm going to talk about the Clot and rehash everything. Wrong! What we're going to do is actually do more than that, because the question really is, how are these things made? Test tube, a synthetic amniotic sac, a meat hole in the ground? Well, if you chose the first two, then obviously you're way too much of a scientist, because the meat hole always wins. During the early stages of the process, a medium needed to be made in order to produce these creatures on a large scale. Given that the Clots were the first to be made, the name Clot Mother was given to this meaty creator. Contained within the biotics lab in the Black Forest, this living but likely not sapient or even sentient creation will take in raw materials and put Clots out. You're probably wondering what that raw material is. Well, those volunteers I mentioned earlier, well, here's probably why you aren't volunteers. Upon being captured, the people are immediately ground up into a fine paste and supplied to the Clot Mother. Clot Mother will then take that ground up bone, immunological cells, skin cells, muscle, and nervous tissue to form Clots out of them. This process is incredibly brutal, but does help to explain some of the things that we actually see within the Clots themselves. This process is likely horrifying and several ways, and you can actually see them, but I imagine it would go as such. With all the material coming in, you are likely to experience several issues if you make a creature with a bunch of mismatched bodies. The biggest issue being that immunological cells from one body being in another is not really good for you. Think of like an organ transplant. If your body rejects that transplant, it will absolutely destroy that organ because it likely views it as like a sort of cancer or invader. Furthermore, even getting the wrong type of blood can be life-threatening as it sparks an internal struggle as the new blood cells are attacked and destroyed, and this can go on to cause kidney damage as well, which ultimately can lead to your end. It's highly important that tissue is compatible. But we also must remember, while these creatures are created to just be clones and super soldiers, I guess so to speak, there is one thing they are not going to overcome on their own, and that is Earth's biome. Every bacteria, virus, and parasite is going to be gunning for the newly formed clots as they just exist without an immune system in place to protect their actual bodies. So with this new tissue, it needs to be fundamentally changed and homogenized in order to stop unwanted interactions between the tissues, considering they are from different people. This is solved by the initial process of adding his son's DNA. It's clear the clot mother operates in a way that forces the introduction of the son's DNA into incoming cells. This process is actually not as complicated as you might think, given the recent technological advancements in our society. I imagine the clot mother uses a similar method. Being made out of meat, I would suspect a delivery method is housed within the cells that it contains. This method is as easy as a DNA virus that is released into the raw materials that were added. Once this is done, the donor cells would be infected. This infection is not there to destroy the cells and create more of the virus, but instead its purpose is there to insert the new genetic sequences, which would be highly important to the functionality of the cell. Upon entering the cell, regardless of what variant of cell it would then head straight to the nucleus using viral polymerase. This polymerase can insert genes directly into the genetic coding of the cell, which alters it in large ways. In fact, this is so common that 8% of our genetic coding is actually ancient viruses, and it has been linked currently that old ancient viruses that we do have within our genetic coding, as just I said, will actually protect your body from being infected by new viruses. Pretty interesting. I would also suspect, along with this, a synthetic excision nuclease, which involves typically with the repair of DNA, but in this instance, it would be used to basically just cut out unwanted DNA, possibly pertaining to the person's original cellular markers and potentially even containing the directions of the original cell's DNA polymerase to instead favor the new DNA that has been encoded there. I've sort of mentioned this before, and it's a little anecdotal, but I actually have a buddy who works specifically with CRISPR and gene editing tools, and basically what he's found is when he goes to repair certain DNA or insert DNA into a person's genes, the body will come back and repair already fixed genes to make them incorrect again, which somewhat hints at possibly a memory of what's supposed to be there, because when you cut out a certain area of genes, it usually has to use one side of the actual strand of DNA to repair the other side. But if both of them are gone, that would usually indicate that it shouldn't be able to repair. It's definitely an interesting thing that they're finding with how your body can repair its own genetic coding. Anyways, kind of got on a tangent there. So from here, the cell has essentially become Kevin's son as it contains his DNA, and this allows for the cells to exist harmoniously with one another without unwanted interactions. Because remember, if an immune cell happens upon a cell that has the wrong major histocompatibility complex, or MHC protein, it will recognize that cell as non-self and attack it. MHC is how our bodies recognize our cells and that they're supposed to be there versus the ones that are not supposed to be there. With this, it ensures that the body still has an immune system that can read the clot cells as self and still allow it to exist within an environment that if the clot mother just took away the immune system, the clot would expire within a few days as the body is inundated with microorganisms that break it down. This is why you can exist and survive for 80 years, but as soon as you expire and your immune system stops functioning, you start to be broken down in days. That's what the environment wants to do to you at all times, but your immune system prevents it. So don't forget to keep it healthy. From here, it's as easy as, say, a mother gestating a child. I know, right? What a statement, because while it doesn't take any mental thought, the body is actually under a tremendous amount of stress to provide for that gestating child, and the child itself is actually under a tremendous amount of selective pressure to grow into a viable offspring, as the world is a cruel place. The first portion likely formed once all of the others have been homogenized would be the central nervous system. Because the cells are not dividing, so to speak, to create this creature, but instead are sort of funneled in, this means by using a template to move the nervous system tissue into place so it can interact like a normal human brain. From here, bones would kind of also begin being placed as the body was continuing to grow around the nervous tissue, then internal structures such as intestines and eyes with muscle coming in, and finally the skin all over the body. This idea that it is kind of placed in this pattern rather than grown from cells becomes apparent when you see that there are actually no sexual characteristics on the males. The cells themselves contain the XY chromosomes, designating them as male, but no genitalia genitalia can be found on the body, indicating that this is just simply something that does not need to be added. And actually, I mean, with us, it's a weak point. So why have it? The Clot mother formed them from, say, something like a fetus, even though when you look at the actual Clot mother, they do look like fetuses. You have to remember, a fetus comes from one egg and one sperm. When they combine, those cells then divide. But with this creature, those cells are funneled into it. So if it were to divide on its own natural genetic information, that would mean sex characteristics would likely form out of natural compulsion and information obtained from that genetic coding. This placement hypothesis also stands up to scrutiny when you understand that these creatures rapidly grow, far outpacing anything that would be considered cellular growth. Then, as the adult comes out of basically this giant vat, we see what would happen to someone that has a human mind capability, but is a completely blank slate. The Clots are vicious and relatively weak creatures, depending on who you ask. While they can definitely eviscerate you, they're not very intelligent, and if you have the right way to defend yourself, you can mow them down in droves. They stand as tall as an average man, with the average British man standing around 5 foot 9 inches or 175.3 centimeters. Their exterior has them caked in blood and completely unclothed, but because there are no primary sex characteristics, it does not really matter. They have no hair on their heads, or really anywhere else for that matter, as this was not a needed trait. This suggests that all the hair follicles on their body were broken down during the raw material phase for more nutritive reasons. Starting with the feet, we see they do have average human feet. Nothing really to note apart from the potentially longer than average toenails, which may explain the fingernails in a moment. The legs, moving up from the feet, are fairly muscular, but no more than, say, like an average human. The abdominal area shows that they have a relatively low body fat percentage, as the abdominal muscles are well defined. In fact, a case could be made that these creatures actually do not have enough body fat, as when we move up to the thoracic region, it can easily be seen that their ribs are visible, and around the diaphragm area, the stomach is sucked in. Moving up to the pectoral region, the muscles are well defined, along with on the back. The shoulders appear larger than normal, however. The muscle here has become well developed as the arms are used in combat, frequently necessitating the body's energy expenditure on this area. The biceps and triceps used in the attacks are also fairly pronounced, as again, this is used in the attack. Moving down to the forearms, more blood shows up with the fingers and hands in general covered in the fluid. Moving back up to the trapezius region, we find this area again is just ridiculously large. Like, there's no need for this much muscle, but I digress. The head is also interesting, but also psychologically it's very intriguing, which we'll go over in a second. The face, or at least the eyes, are kind of sunken in. The lips have been curled back, revealing jagged teeth, which are likely not uniform due to them being acquired by several different people. The eyes are rather large, as the eyelids do not seem to have fully formed, leaving a wide stare. Again, there's no hair anywhere on the head, and the nose does not seem to have been a staple formation either, with it appearing more like holes leading into the nasal cavity. Getting to the brain, this is what I find most interesting about Clots. Now, the raw material ground up completely tears apart the central nervous system of a person. All memories, ideas, personality, wants, dreams, whatever hopes, yada yada yada, are destroyed in the process as the neuron is ripped from neuron and lost forever. Once the DNA is added into the cell and formed within the Clot mother, this ensures the neurons are now compatible with one another and won't be destroyed. But even still, this means the brain is essentially a clean slate as an adult. There is no prior knowledge or opinions on what's going on. There's just biology and genetic expression into a physical form. So the question is, why are the Clots so aggressive then? Well, biology is an interesting concept when it comes to psychology. My wife actually has her master's in clinical mental health, and me being a microbiologist, we have a lot of disagreements on where behaviors come from. You know, the age-old argument of nature versus nurture. Look at it this way. She thinks, let's say you have a house with a cracked wall. If you repair the wall, then the house is fixed. I believe, however, you need to repair the foundation that's sinking the house to fix the house. Now, both are potentially correct, but I believe biologically, if you can fix the root of a problem, then behaviorally, that will have more of a profound effect on the actual issue. Now, I am not a psychologist, so I could be incorrect, but for the Clots, I believe this is the issue. With no prior interaction, no understanding of the world, why do they choose aggression rather than attempting to come to terms with what's around them? Does that mean humanity is similar? Well, in a way. Humans are still animals. Well, by that, I mean we are still animals. We get scared, we deal with the stressors of life, and every once in a while, despite us being a higher thinking primate, we go full ape mode, and our brains are overcome by chimp energy. What are the joys of being primates, it seems? Now, the point of this rambling is, I would suggest there is something fundamentally different with the Clots. Apart from the fact that they are built rather than formed, because of the clean slate that they have no ability to rationalize the world, and because of that whatever is in their foundation is expressed more readily. Take a serial, well, I guess I've already said killing floor several times, so killer. Would they choose to operate in society for any period of time if we all had a blank slate for a mind? Likely not. I believe what we are seeing with Kevin's son is the expression of a mental instability that is likely dwelling within, but with a mind that is influenced by the world around it, you know, the nurture aspect. The nature of the person was balanced out. However, with zero nurture, the pure nature of this ailment is allowed to come out, which results in the aggression seen within the clots. But hey, that's just a theory. Anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on what I post. Let me know what you guys thought about this and if you liked it or not. I mean, I want to cover all the variants, so I'll probably just do that anyways, but I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our 2 astronauts, Lipsy Gingy and Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thank you guys. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer, as well as Phoenix, and our scientists, Countryside Limbo and Seth Johnson. And the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. For real, your help does go a long way, especially with all the age restriction going on, and it isn't expected at all, so it's greatly appreciated. All right, so that's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed. See y'all in the next one.